Well, of course, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful to the organizers to have invited me to speak at the very moment when I'm falling asleep. So if I do fall asleep, you can do it at your school during my talk now. All right, I'll have to go consistently fast in order to stick with the 40 minutes, but consciousness, there's two questions you can ask. How are we conscious? So this is a question about the mechanisms, but of course here we're interested in this other question, why is it the case that we're conscious? Because that's a question about the function of consciousness. And that's what I've been trying to work on using this URC grant that Dave mentioned. So those two questions, how, why, how is about the functional aspects of consciousness, what consciousness does, has been mostly looked at by cognitive neuroscience, exploring the mechanisms, the neural correlates. And by and large, one of the conclusions that comes out of that work, perhaps in the direction of Matthes's talk, is that phenomenal experience where it feels like doesn't do much. And the why question has been mostly investigated by philosophers. It's about the phenomenal aspects of consciousness, what it feels like. And, likewise, there's been conclusions that mental states cannot be causally effective. This is Kim's exclusion argument, that consciousness is a delusion, epiphenomenon. And so altogether, that phenomenal experience has no function. I think both of these conclusions are wrong, and that we should rethink this distinction. And the proposal is that the function of consciousness should give value to what we do. That's the core idea. Indeed, what would be the point of doing anything at all if the doing wasn't doing something to you as a subject? Conscious agents care about their experiences in a way that zombies or AI systems do not. In other words, consciousness matters, and this I call the phenomenal primacy. And I think it's an important issue, this issue of the function of consciousness, of course, because the scope and the extent of conscious processing has been under attack from different quarters, philosophy, illusionism, epiphenomenalism, and so on. From psychology, this idea that in consciousness is a very powerful system, basically assumed to be capable of doing whatever you do with consciousness, except without it. The focus on NCC, neural correlates, I think, has also sort of put the subject outside the picture. And of course, AI, that's had a demonstration of the skills of artificial intelligence these days, further reduce the scope of our, or the import of conscious experience. Dragerword wrote, however, it seems absurd to us that a pain, a mood, a wish should go about the world without barrier independently. An experience is impossible with an experience. The inner world presupposes the person whose inner world it is. And I feel that in many cases we have sort of lost track of this important aspect of consciousness that it requires a subject. Stewart, in a thought experiment from 1998, asked whether anyone would accept zombification. So suppose that offer you a truly valuable reward, maybe it's $1 billion, etc., etc. What would it take for you to accept to be zombified? By which he means you keep all your non-phenomenal goods, but you're basically a walking zombie. Nothing feels like anything anymore. And I think we all understand that this would amount to death. Nobody would ever choose to do this unless it would be for a truly formidable reward, and it would amount to sacrifice your own life in order to get that reward. So, based on that, we wrote this paper a couple of years ago now with Catherine Talon-Baudry, in which we argued that all subjective experiences are endowed with intrinsic value. One way of seeing this is, for examples of the difference, for instance, between being fed through an intravenous perfusion versus eating a meal. Both serve the same physiological functions, but of course, everyone supposed to have the canonical meal. We think that computing subjective value enables agents to free themselves from the shackles of evolution. This explains dangerous behaviors like base jumping, etc., etc. Why do we do this? Well, because we like those experiences, even though engaging in them or engaging in the behaviors that produce those kinds of experiences go fundamentally against your fitness. Animals play, I really love this video. Sliding down the roof on a plastic bed. He keeps doing it because that goes down again. I think it's really delightful. Is it crowd conscious? Of course, that's the big question, but he doesn't seem to do this. He doesn't seem to engage in this behavior that doesn't serve any function, except, so why does he do it? Well, he does it because he likes the effect that it does on what he feels. So, second idea in that paper is that consciousness works as a common currency. Phenomenal experience, when associated with value, functions as a sort of common currency in the sense that all experiences now take place in a unified phenomenal space, a quality space that is shaped by subjects' cognitive and affective history, that is your preferences. And computing subjective value in this phenomenal space thus enables and explains the unity of consciousness. The subjective value of different experiences can now be compared, which makes it possible to answer brief questions such as, do you prefer having a day off next month or having a dessert today? And more generally, to arbitrate between different forces of action, something Walter Weitz, and I come back to that later, for pathological complexity. And finally, this also makes it possible to trade experiences with others, experiences on a soul, with something. There's a subfield of tourism, which is called experiential tourism, where what is being sold is not the destination, etc. It's the experiences that you go to. We've continued to develop these ideas with this paper, which is now being revised for special issue dedicated to the function of consciousness, edited by Tecumseh Finch and Colin Allen for philosophical transactions. And we look a little bit more precisely at issues that have to do with the function of consciousness. This is a really interesting but rather complicated article that came out in Neuroscience of Consciousness a couple of years ago, in which the authors distinguish between, well, what is the functional basis of consciousness? That is, I think, if I got that right, the right functions, and what are the functional what is the functional contribution of consciousness? That is the Cleeremans function, if I got it right. I was not aware of that terminology. I won't go through the details here, but of course, you can think about necessity and sufficiency conditions with this in mind. And of course, you know, this sort of a strange loop between the functions that are required for consciousness and the functional contribution that conscious mental states make to further functions. Steve Fleming, jokingly, described it this way. One perspective is that consciousness is causal. You cannot implement function X without being conscious of the inputs and outputs of X. And that's an implicit assumption of the aesthetics proposal. So you might be able to see a painting unconsciously, but you wouldn't have any appreciation of it. Feeling requires awareness. And of course, another perspective you can have on this whole functions question is that consciousness is a consequence of implementing function X. This is the work of Ginsburg and Jablonka, for instance, who argue that universal associative learning is a sort of marker of consciousness during evolution. But on this perspective, consciousness is in one sense epiphenomenal as it comes along for the ride as a consequence of implementing particular functions. Walter Weitz has this great paper about, and I don't like that expression, what he calls pathological complexity, and the complexity he has in mind is the sort of complexity that comes with complicated multicellular life, in which you require some sort of system, a nervous system, to coordinate the activity of many different factors. And this is the way he describes one possible story. It's a just so story, of course, about the evolution of consciousness. He writes, complex organisms need to assess, and it's actually not just him, it's also us. Complex organisms need to assess the survival value of stimuli and their own actions, but they have no access to it. They don't have access to the fitness function itself. Evolution can solve this with hard-coded patterns, but only to a certain degree of complexity. And then the argument is that valence, is this a good or a bad experience, appears as a proxy signal in complex animals, so that it enables them to work out trade-offs, common currency, and reinforces whatever it is associated with and motivates them. And from that point on, valence, in addition to functioning as a signal, can also become a target, at which once it ceases to function as a signal. This is Goodhart's law in economics. Experiences, in that sense, can become decoupled from the signaling value insofar as evolutionary fitness is concerned. Now, this idea that experience serves as a marker for extrinsic fitness functions or extrinsic value can be attributed to William James, who expressed this. What feels phenomenally good or bad and what physically benefits or harms us go together. And that's one story about the origin of experience. You use it as a signal to indicate what you're doing that's good, that serves your fitness function, and to invite you to avoid doing those things and to motivate you to do the good things. So, in this sense, consciousness is a Fisherian runaway. Sensations are worth caring for because they communicate something about the conditions that are hostile or beneficial to the organism. It's a proxy for epistemically opaque fitness. The information about the adaptive value carried by analog states as an input to a number of more complex cognitive functions, which in turn makes it possible to control behavior in increasingly flexible ways, achieving, for instance, motivational trade-offs. But the key point is that once phenomenal experience plays the role of indicating the extrinsic value of different courses of action, it can acquire intrinsic value on its own and become separate from its evolutionary function, yet remain motivated. And that explains why we do things that don't harm us. The only reason we do that is because we like the experiences. There's a good picture of that. Who knows how to spoke? Maybe conscious phenomenology that promotes global broadcasting, something like the reverse of what the global workspace of consciousness supposes. And I think I agree with this. Perhaps, as Wright suggests, valence experience comes first. The evaluative function is the thing that drives the whole thing. And then it becomes a signal to many consuming system, makes it possible to achieve global availability, etc. I'm just showing this. This is Richard Crum, an evolutionary biologist, who describes the same situation insofar as sexual selection is concerned. You can see those birds of paradise engaged in this incredibly complicated mating behavior. And in biology, there's the same debate between people who would like to reduce sexual selection processes to natural selection processes, so find an adaptive value, a signaling value to say pick up, stay, etc., etc. And other people like him who say, no, he's doing this to manipulate the mental states of the female. So this is an aesthetics theory of sexual selection. That's amazing display. Anyway, I find it very interesting that this very debate that we're having also takes place in evolutionary biology. So, which functions are necessary for consciousness? Well, if you take Gensburg and Jablonka here, for instance, they say universal associative learning, and then they list this set of features that would be functions leading to consciousness. But fact points out that all those features are derived from human consciousness. But he says the evaluative ability to avoid harmful stimuli and seek out beneficial ones is supremely important to survival matters. And so perhaps the beginning of experience is just that, the evaluative function. What functions does consciousness enable? That's Matthias's list. If it is an intrinsic proxy signal to inform organisms of the extrinsic value of different stimuli process of action, then it leads, we believe, to multimodal integration in the subject-centered. This is crucial. Phenomenal space, valent functions as a common currency that makes it possible to compare different courses of actions, circumstances, and behavioral trade-offs. It leads to global availability because this valenced signal can now be input to a variety of consuming systems that enable increased flexibility. The increased flexibility that is required when you have complex organisms. And then this leads also to the emergence of subject-level meaning and motivation. This is Gavin Mitchell describing the emergence of subjects by appealing to, when it says, organisms become low-key of concern. Basically, they care about what's going on to them. So those were all the sort of half philosophical items that I wanted to put forward. And now the question, because ultimately I'm a psychologist, is how do we turn this into an empirical project? And that's what my DLC project is about. And that's what I'll go over now. It has 4 components, and one is completely philosophical. I'm very proud to have philosophers in my lab. We're thinking about the function of experience, perhaps abandoning the distinction between access and phenomenal consciousness, reaffirming the central role of experience in everything that we do, and ask how did consciousness evolve. We're thinking about the valence of experience, the subjective experience intrinsically balanced, which would fall from the perspectives that I put forward. And we're thinking of the value of experience as subjective experience intrinsically valuable, thus computing subjective value enables agents to free themselves from the shackles of evolution. And the very important question, can value be unconscious? As a reward that you're unconscious of still rewarding? Would you do the things you need to do to get an unconscious orgasm? Does that make sense? I'm so sure. So, does it make sense to talk about unconscious rewards? Reinforcement learning, this is a big issue in that literature as well, are driven by rewards, but the rewards themselves only have extrinsic value. They define what the system will do with respect to its extrinsic reward functions that have 0 values for the system itself. When AlphaGo wins, it is Dennis Hassibis who goes to win the champagne. AlphaGo doesn't even know it won the tournament, and it has no idea of the meaning of I should say, winning the tournament. And so the key for a reward to have intrinsic value is precisely subjective experience. For in its absence, there's nobody for whom the reward means anything. And again, in the reinforcement learning literature, it's called the reward paradox. Solms wrote something similar, asking whether feelings can be conscious. Here's what it says: but to the point of becoming aware of physical processes, if your awareness has no influence upon those processes, how can the function of feeling go on in the dark without any feeling? We can legitimately ask why vision is accompanied by conscious experience. Vision doesn't require consciousness, and neither does any cognitive process, but feeling does. There will be no such thing as a feeling that we do not feel. Unconscious feeling as unmaximal. Recently, we looked at people's intuitions that feelings can be unconscious. We looked at the study by Sitzma from 2020. They asked the subjects to answer questions after reading small vignettes. One of them is fear disorders, often sustained service injuries, but show no sign of feeling any pain, continuing to display normal behavior. They also deny that they feel any pain. Only after the end of the battle, the soldiers proclaim they feel severe pain and show clear pain behavior. The 2 options that people could choose from is during the battle, the injured soldier has a pain but doesn't feel it, or during the battle, the injured soldier has no pain. And we thought that's missing a category, which is during the battle, the injured soldier does have a pain that they feel, but they don't pay attention. Right. I think this entire literature and in the entire psychological literature, there's a huge confusion between unconscious processing and unattended processing. So we did this study again, experimental philosophy, so to speak. We replicated the original finding. So people said soldiers have unfelt pains. But when we add our modification, you can see that people choose the category of unattended pain, which seems to make sense to us. So no unconscious pain, unattended. All right. So that was the first bit of this project. In the second bit, we're exploring the idea that all conscious perception is valence. If, as we argue, experience has intrinsic value, then all conscious perception should be valenced. Zion wrote, we do not see just a house, we see a handsome house, an ugly house, or a pretentious house, something for the missing bit here. And so if you look at the cognitive neurosciences or effective cognitive neurosciences, people typically use strongly negative stimuli such as nice, strongly positive stimuli such as flowers, And in the middle of the range, you have neutral stimuli like pulses. Sophie Lebrecht developed the idea together with Lisa Feldman-Barrett and Mike Parr, the idea that one can speak of microwaves. That is, that even in this supposedly neutral region, people still have differences. There's a house that we prefer to the other two. It's not strongly balanced, but it's micro-balanced. And so the plan here is to look at people's similarity judgments, people microvalence judgment, and I'll tell you something about that in just a bit, to do at what neural networks do, because they provide a sort of measure of objective similarity, so to speak, and then to look at what the brain is doing, and to compare everything, we'll use representational similarity analysis. And we've started doing that actually, going in the same direction as some beautiful studies trying to analyze the structure of the quality space that we owe to Hebert and Phillips. So these are the people doing this study, Ivanche, Esmentek, and Veneshikar, and the idea is to prove that all conscious perception is balanced. And this is asking, well, what is experience? So when I think about what I experience when I see the statue of red, all I can come up with is to try to characterize my experience is all the memory associations that go with red, and that's my subjectivity too, because those memories are not the same for me and for you, but also all the valences associated with those different experiences, right? And that seems to capture what it means for me to see a patch of red. And so there is evidence that valence is computed automatically. Here's a study, I won't go into the details, that shows that, for instance, valence is computed even when you ask people to make judgments about the age of an object. And the approach we've taken is to try to show that valence is present in the similarity space. So we ask people to make judgments about which of three items they would keep for their birthday and which they would reject. So this we call it's the birthday task, basically. We compare that with an odd one out task, which people judge which of three objects is different from the two others. And we can do this for subordinate categories, or cups, or umbrellas, or teapots, or we can do this for different objects, objects belonging to different categories, coaches, tables, and methods, etc. And then we can compute the microvalence associated with the choices that people make in the birthday task. Now we can show that those choices correspond to the microvalence that they express when seeing the objects individually. So it really reflects how they feel towards the object. And then we can do exactly the same thing for the similarity blocks, compute relative distances between the presented objects and the distances between microvalence scores. We build these representational dissimilarity matrices. And then we also did that with AlexNet, the idea being that the network doesn't have affective preferences, so it's just going to compute how perceptually similar two objects are, and we can compute those RDMs for all layers of these complicated deep learning networks. And just to go very quickly, what we find is that valence is present in the similarity space. So if you look at the distances in the similarity quality space and you look at valence, well, they seem to correlate with some of the dimensions of the similarity space. And as you can see on the left, valence explains or correlates with similarity, mostly in the subordinate. So when you're comparing objects of the same category, if you're looking at objects from different categories, well, maybe people will say, keep the couch because it has more utility for you. If you're comparing cups, then of course, your subjective liking or disliking of one of the cups will influence your judgments of similarity. But so that's one of the ways we're trying to show that all conscious perception is valence. It also interestingly correlates valence with the low-level visual features, that is the activity in the very early layers of the network, like AlexNet. Okay, the second hypothesis is that only conscious perception is valent. So of course, this is a lot more controversial. But to get at that, we manipulate consciousness as a variable. And to do that, we use this unique screen that we have built in Brussels that Matthias used, which is called a histoscope, and which makes it possible to achieve presentation times of arbitrarily complex visual stimuli in the microsecond range. So I can show something on the screen for 1, 2, 10 microseconds. These are really, really small durations. And what we can do with this is develop a novel minimal exposure duration methodology, which consists of trying to figure out what the thresholds are that are required by the visual system to achieve a particular discrimination, right? So it's a completely different approach than masking, which I think has the benefit of being really clean. Because masking is complicated. There's lots of debates about CFS, for instance. Sandwich masking, likewise, complicated, expensive, and not exactly the same. But I'm very interested in what we're finding on this. How much energy do you need to carry out a given discrimination, and how are the underlying processing stages organized? In other words, what are the priorities of the visual system? And with that, we're going to try to prove that effective processing requires awareness. We now have this paper in Nature Publications that was the work of Renzo Lanfranco. Faces, nicely controlled with scrambled counterparts, equated for luminance and contrast. People see those faces on the screen. Again, there's a location test, just as in your experiment, 22 locations left and right. And people have to make a decision about first the location, second the emotional expression of the face, and then we use stats to ask people to describe their experience. We varied presentation durations, and very quickly again, because let me keep with time, what we find is that location sensitivity, which we compute through D prime. Well, this requires about 4.4 milliseconds for holistic processing. That is to see the difference between upright faces and inverted faces. So it's the face inversion effect. And so that reflects holistic processing of the face, and it requires about 4.4 milliseconds of processing. Again, without masks. And then, insofar as emotion identification is concerned, again, we got D prime, that takes about 5.3 milliseconds of exposure. And so the processing of emotion, visual emotion, seems to, at best, accompany perceptual awareness, but it certainly doesn't come before perceptual awareness. So we also carried out a gazillion. This paper has a supplementary material with 1,000 experiments, etc. So you can go look at it. But so basically, we can discriminate the face from its scrambled counterpart with about 2.6 milliseconds of exposure. Both the psychophysics and the ERP components, including decoding analysis, conventionally suggest holistic face processing at about 4.3 milliseconds of exposure. But emotion processing takes longer. It takes about between 5 and 6 milliseconds. That is the point where visual awareness is very. Now, admittedly, this is not priming. So I'm not saying if processing affect in the face is completely impossible, but with those voluntary responses, people need to be aware that there's a face in order to process what emotion it shows. With Louis Boulness, who's sitting at the back of the room there, in new experiments, we've also collected facial mimicry data. So we're looking at the activation of the facial musculature, where the face displays a fearful emotion or an angry emotion, for instance. And it looks like we find facial mimicry at about 1.5 milliseconds of exposure, which would go exactly in your direction, suggesting that action can be it eye movements or facial musculature can be driven by the emotion that is shown to people even before people become perceptual. So this goes against the main claim that we're trying to show that The processing of affect requires emotion, but faces are special in many different ways. And so maybe that's an exception. We're going to look at other conditions as well. And we expect this claim remains true. Third aspect, we're looking at action, and we're asking, can intentional action be driven by unconscious intent? We don't think that's the case. We don't think that's the case. And so, there's a number of experiments looking at motivation based on unconscious stimuli or invisible stimuli, I should say. And so one of those experiments was an experiment by Matthias Bessiglione. Very visible, those two studies. And so basically, the idea is that if you perceive a high reward, or if you're shown a high reward, even if you claim not to see this reward, you will exert more effort to obtain a proportion of this high reward. And they used hand grips. It does require some effort.
What if it's anger about the things that are showing? What if it's anger about the things that
So here's the study, which mimics the original study from Castiglione. We use again this typical screen. In the original study, it was masking. We also replicated the masking conditions. So there's a fixation point, there's a stimulus, high value coin, low value coin, then there's thermometer, and you can make the mercury, so to speak, in the thermometer rise by pushing as hard as you can on the hand grip, and then that makes you obtain a fraction of the reward. And so the idea, of course, is that if it's a high reward, that is when you press on the hand grip. If it's a low reward, maybe you won't bother pressing as hard, or maybe you won't press at all. And then, of course, you collect visibility judgments, etc. In the replication, we also use TDG. Again, very quickly, this is the work of Lena Lange, by the way. Here's what we see, unmasked conditions, masked conditions. The main thing when we're looking at seeing responses, so when people see, I've seen the stimulus, and we're looking at correct responses, can they discriminate between the high and the low value reward? So there's no pressing on hand grip in these data. As you can see, it's much sharper, the transition with the Kistoscope. So we use 3 durations. This one is about 4.3 milliseconds of exposure. In the masked version that replicates the original study, we get a lot more seeing responses for this middle duration than the original study, which is reason to question the original findings, of course, and we get more or less the same pattern of results for correct responses. Now, what happens with the hand grip? Well, basically, the hand grip data, so this measures over time the force exerted from the hand grip. At this in blue, you have the low rewards, in orange, the high rewards. And basically what we find is that the only circumstance in which people exert effort is when they have seen the high, which is what you would expect. Here's the same data by class rate. So this goes in the same direction of some of the studies that Matthias has mentioned earlier. And indeed, you can have questions about those studies, but there's evidence accumulating that learning in general requires some degree of awareness, that instrumental conditioning also requires awareness that goes in the direction that we want to go in. Final study, and there's no study yet. We're going to try to show what seems obvious, which is that phenomenal experience has functional effects. That is what we choose to do is driven by what we experience. And to do that, we can use placebos, phenomenal control methods, use we call hypnosis. And so prove that what we feel changes what we do. One of the experiments that we've done with this is investigating cognitive control. So for instance, in any situation where you have congruent and incongruent primes and targets, for instance, you can show that if people make a mistake, that is they've just processed an incongruent trial in which the prime indicates one direction, for instance, and the target another direction. There's a slowdown in reaction times on the next one. This is called the Cleeremans effect from the person who found this effect, and it reflects adaptation to the conflict. You're responding too fast, you made a mistake, and so you slow down. There's some evidence that it is what you feel. So the question is, do you feel the conflict or not? There's some evidence that what you feel counts just as much as the presence of actual conflict. What we're doing is we're eliminating the conflict itself. So we're making people believe that there can be a conflict, but there's never an actual conflict. For instance, an incompatibility between two opposing responses. If we can reduce the feeling of conflict in those people, will this still show this conflict adaptation effect? That's an open question. That's the work of Anastasia. Okay, I'm almost done. Maybe I'm clear. Surprise.
Please share this up.
Oh, no,
Yeah, still got 3 minutes.
Okay, well,
That's fine. We encourage less than 40 minutes.
yeah, okay. So here's Dan Dennett, and I think when one thinks about the evolution of consciousness and the whole evolutionary story, here's what he said: how do we go from doing things for reasons to having reasons for doing things? And I think this exactly captures the sort of distinction that we're interested in. We're doing
What that
things.
distinction is,
Well,
it's out of us, people are really.
Well, many organisms do things for reasons that are not their own. They do
That's
things
what you mean.
for reasons that have been installed by evolution, right?
Okay.
Because for survival, basically fitness. But we do things for that, but also we have our own reasons that can be completely disconnected from any adaptive value to do the things that we do. And I think this juncture in evolution is the thing that we're interested in when we're trying to figure out the functions. So I think that finding a function for phenomenal experience is really an urgent philosophical problem at a time when everything seems to be done algorithmic. I think that consciousness matters. I think we all know that, but reminding ourselves that this is indeed the case. That's my team working on this ERC, and this is my lab, and I thank you.
Okay, Andrew. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really fascinating. So I guess I have a question about why we should call this a function rather than a byproduct that we care about. So like I kind of understand the notion of a function in evolutionary biology is just like some sort of selective effect. And I kind of understand function in like ordinary English or in other areas of science where it just means some sort of cause of something or just consequence. But I'm not clear what your notion of function is. So why not just say it's a byproduct, doesn't really have an evolutionary function, but we care about it anyways. Maybe we care about it for the reasons you're saying. Gives us a purpose of doing things. You see what I mean?
That is what I've said. I'm not saying consciousness, phenomenal experience is a standard sort of accident in evolution. On the contrary, just as James argued, I think that what you feel is indicative of extrinsic conditions that reflect your fitness or that reflect evolutionary constraints, right? So if I'm doing a bad thing, I'm going to feel bad about it. And the sort of function of that feeling is precisely to drive you to avoid doing the things that are bad for you, as defined by the evolutionary function or fitness function, and to drive you towards doing more of the good things. Right? So that's the original idea.
So you're saying that if there's a population of humans, one who can't have this kind of self-reflective capacity to think about what's good for us, they would die out.
Yeah, exactly.
And the ones we
It's a feeling. It doesn't. I mean, it can be enriched by self-awareness, by metacognition, like global availability, etc. But one hypothesis is that the starting point is simply that big. Getting subject level variance complex.
So what is the function? So the function of the feeling is what?
Well, the function of experience is to inform the subject about the fitness of the actions that it engages in.
Thank you. So I was sympathetic to the claims you made about the value of consciousness in the first part of the talk. I had a harder time seeing the connection with some of the claims you made in the second part of the talk about consciousness. Let me just pick one. So the suggestion that we need to collapse the distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness. I wondered why that was so crucial for you. I also thought it didn't fit so well with what you said about the example of the soldier in battle. So I had a lot of sympathy with your thought there that we didn't have enough options on the screen. We needed to add the possibility that the soldier might feel pain, but without attending or noticing their pain. But it seemed to me that even if the pain was not noticed, it could feel painful, it could indeed feel unpleasant. And that noticing the pain might turn a pain that was phenomenally conscious, but access unconscious, into one that's both phenomenal and access conscious. And indeed, you could run the very same structure, I think, with Ned's original examples, where the sound of the kind of humming refrigerator or the drill in the street, that could be phenomenally conscious. It could be an unpleasant feeling, but then attending to it could. So could you say something about how you were seeing the connection between the claims about value and then collapsing the distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness?
Yeah, collapsing the distinction is, I think, a reaction to the idea that phenomenal experience doesn't do it. That you can have experiences that are just sitting there and they're functioning, or the lack causal effects. So I think that whatever we would describe as phenomenal consciousness always has some causal effects. So it's, I guess it's a reaction towards the epiphenomenalist danger of the distinction, basically. But maybe you disagree with me.
Oh, I completely disagree.
Yeah.
The function in that original paper, that it greases the phenomenal consciousness greases the wheels of access.
Yeah.
I didn't claim it was ineffective, it didn't do anything.
You suggested though, Ned.
What?
You do suggest it. I was just teaching it to my undergrads.
Okay, that was one possibility.
Yeah. Among three that you just.
It was one possibility.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. But so I don't know. I mean, it's an open question. To me, it doesn't make any sense to have an experience that you cannot access. So I guess that's the position that I took at some point. Yeah. Yeah, it feels like what Solves has with, right? It's a feeling that you don't feel. That's the way I understand this. And that seems to be an oxymoron.
By the way, speaking of phenomenal overflow, I also asked ChatGPT for a joke about Ned Block. For his talk, he talks them in two versions: access consciousness, which you'll remember well enough to ask questions about, and phenomenal consciousness, which will overflow your working memory, lead through the fire exits, and will still be presenting in the hallway long after the session ends. Fun stuff. If you suddenly feel there's more in your mind than you can report, congratulations, you just experienced block level overflow. Okay, Matthias.
Yeah, I was thinking that the idea that for any kind of instrumental learning, you need consciousness sounds widely implausible for the reason that you have instrumental learning in spinalized rats, so in rats spinal cords separated from the brain, or instrumental learning in headless cockroaches, for example. And so I was thinking that maybe a way of making your views slightly weaker, but still preserving your main idea would be that there are two systems for learning. One automatic, that comes, from evolution, that you can find all around in many different kinds of animals, maybe even in sponges or whatever. And a more complex value system where you can compare the different values together, which is more flexible or something like that. So your view is a weaker not the strong view that.
Yeah, probably. Look, I mean, to be honest, I'm still of two minds about it, and I've had numerous discussions with David Shanks, for instance, about this. But awareness cannot be turned off, as I mentioned, and so it may be the case that for humans, instrumental learning is always accompanied by that instrumental learning is always accompanied by conscious awareness. And that perhaps is not the case for verbal organisms, etc. So indeed, it would be an automatic system, so to speak, an unconscious learning system. But it turns out to be the case in humans that this activity of that system is always accompanied by consciousness.
I remember,
And the reason is you cannot turn it up. Right?
I remember a guy called Axel Cleeremans who studied very deeply the Perugia effect,
Yeah.
which shows that you get dissociations between two learning systems, one of which is related to consciousness and another which is unconscious.
I agree that this is the Perugia effect, and I won't go into the details. The Perugia effect is the only experimental condition with that Shanks recognized as a maybe plausible demonstration of unconscious learning.
Okay. Yeah, Marisa.
Really nice talk. I have a couple of experimental questions just to make sure that I understand. And one of them is that you mentioned that you do the coding analysis with a very fast code, and when you have a degree, and I was wondering what's the time that you need for that? And like how does that correlate with the timing of the stimulus presentation?
Yeah, the stimulus presentation is just obviously it's not the time available for processing, right?
Sure.
So you just send this and then
Yeah, so I was just
and then
wondering what
you
is
track
the,
what's going on.
yeah, what is the time window that you have in order to
Yeah,
do
this
it?
I don't remember. I don't remember.
And
But seconds.
And is this all electrodes or can you inform what the source of that is?
Yeah, I think so. But let's see. I don't think we
Yeah.
I didn't carry out the.
It is in the nature communication. Okay.
Yeah.
And the second question was, what is are there any instructions regarding the grip response, or is it just? Because if I'm holding something in an experiment, I may be wondering how I'm holding this, right?
Oh, no.
So what is the instruction there?
People grip intentionally. Right?
Yeah.
They're told the harder you grip, the more of the reward that you saw or didn't see.
Okay,
You
so
will get, right?
Okay, so they are doing this gripping
They are doing this-
voluntarily.
They are doing this completely intentionally. It's
Okay,
that they do it to get a fraction of the. So the study is a study about the possibility of unconsciously motivating people to do the things they need to do in order
but so
to.
the actually voluntary.
The action is completely voluntary.
Thanks.
Hey, Ned.
That was a great talk with so many results. So one of them intrigues me. You mentioned that microvalence work. And, back in the day, I actually read Sophie LeBrec's thesis.
That's amazing.
And, and here's the thing, she used what seems to be a pretty similar paradigm to you. So just for, well, the issue is you see these things, like you see a teapot and then another teapot, and you say, it's, would I return it or would I keep it? It's going to be my birthday. And then her hypothesis was, well, if two teapots are both, +2 desirable, that will be a perceptual attribute that will make them seem more similar, just as if they were both green. But she got no results, whereas you did. So what's the difference?
She got results.
No, she did. Her thesis, nothing from her thesis was published.
No, I know.
Her thesis was not published and she left the field. So.
We should have the field to work at Apple, so. Maybe that's a good reason.
So, but why did you get results? Or maybe there,
I think she got results, I'm not so sure. I mean, for instance, the funny test comes straight from her thesis.
yeah, no, there were reliable
Yeah.
ratings. Yeah. But in terms of similarity analysis, you didn't get it.
She got this interaction between basic and subordinate levels.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe it was not very significant, but yeah, there must be one of those interactions that worked.
Sophie.
Did you You do referee.
No, I just read it because I was interested.
How did you get it?
I think I might have done from her or from Michael Todd.
Okay.
I can send it to you.
No, I mean, so that's from my
To sort of shift topics, I guess I just wanted to ask about the awards have to involve subjective experience to have intrinsic value. So I guess I was thinking of sort of a strange thought experiment. So suppose I've been kidnapped by an evil neuroscientist, and unfortunately, this evil neuroscientist decided that she wants to zombify me. So and there's no way I can escape. So in a couple of hours, my phenomenal consciousness will be completely gone permanently. On the bright side, I do have choices for how this zombification would go. So if I pick, there's option one, there's option two. Pick option one, then for the rest of my life, every game I ever play, I'll win. Every paper that I ever write will be published. In whatever journal I want. I'll get to eat my favorite food for every meal. And whenever I want to do food, it'll be served to me. I'll get to listen to my favorite music all day if I want to do that. So basically, I'll get everything I want. Option two, none of that happens. It seems to me like just intuitively, there is a sense in which choosing option one would be better for me.
You're a zombie either way, right?
Yeah, I'm a zombie either way, but it seems like there would be a sense in which option one would be better for me. It would be better for me to live as a zombie and get everything I want than to live as a zombie and not get everything I want anyway. And so and it doesn't seem to me that the reason why is just that the things that I want are extrinsically valuable. So for example, me eating my favorite food every day doesn't seem to do anything for anyone else.
I don't think you really understand what it means to be a zombie.
Where's you doing?
But it's interesting, that version of the story is interesting because Ilya Kligo invented a slightly adapted version of Stewart's original thought experiment by proposing to people either that they be zombified as in or that for the rest of their lives, whatever they experience will sort of slowly drift towards the disagreeable. So it's never going to be horrible, but whatever you feel will feel worse and worse and worse over time, right? In whatever ways you can think of. And it's a shallow slope, right? So it's not horrible. His intuition is that people would choose that. As opposed to again be losing phenomenal consciousness altogether. And if I look at my intuitions, yeah, I think even if it gets worse, it always does anyway. Even if it gets worse, I think I would choose that versus losing phenomenal consciousness altogether.
Can we do follow-ups?
Sure, quick follow-up.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I actually have the same intuition that if I had to choose between my phenomenal experience gets worse or goes away, I would choose for it to get worse. But given that in this scenario, it's going to go away, I don't have the option of choosing for it to get worse.
Right.
It still seems to me like the better thing for me to do would be to basically make my life as good as possible, even though I would never feel the difference. I think that it's also maybe just I have
you choose that for your age too.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think I sort of have like objective lists, like your intuitions about well-being versus like intuitions about well-being. That's a important thing. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So I think in response to Soph's question, maybe sort of unclear whether the talk, like the primary aim is like intrinsic value in an ethical sense versus kind of functional sense. And I guess
Function.
good. Okay, so if it's the functional, then I think I want to follow up on Matthias's points, where I think there are some experimental results that kind of push a little bit against the idea that the common currency is hedonic valence or sort of the experience of that kind. I'll just mention three that I seem relevant off the top of my head. There are unconscious reward signals in humans. Like for instance, signals from our guts will bias us in sort of evaluation of behavior deliberately. Secondly, in rats, that if you operate on them to remove their taste buds, they will still be rewarded by sucrose, even though they don't taste it. And that will update. Also, the converse, if you do keep their taste, but you remove the sucrose, it also functions like it tracks the sucrose, not the taste. Thirdly, you can block the release of dopamine to like basically nullify any effect from like hedonic influence because the pleasure centers is separate, like this is the work of Ken Parrish. All of these things make me think that like common currency of motivation and valence are not the same thing. Yeah.
So those are good points. And of course, you know, I'm not saying that unconscious reward processing is completely impossible. Obviously, you know, we have to be somewhere in the middle here. I think that for phenomenal experience to capture variance, the fact that phenomenal experience, if phenomenal experience captures variance, it considerably increases the flexibility of control mechanisms for complicated organisms. But presumably, yes, some of these things have been automatized, even in us. Think of a reflex, you know, obviously, your hand is out of the fire before you even realize what was going on. That was obviously installed by evolution, and it's a very rigid system, right? At contrario, you can keep your hand in the fire if for some reason you want to do that, right? So consciousness makes it possible for you to exert additional control of the behavior, but there have to be priors in evolution where this is all going on basically without experience. And it's an open question too, right? I mean, some people who were discussing this when you were discussing this would like to extend the button of conscious feelings to lots of animals based on the same sorts of arguments that have been defending here. But it doesn't have to be that way. And so we're still stuck with figuring out what counts, ultimately. The point I want to make is that it probably in the view that we're sort of developing, it begins with things. Phenomenal experience begins with things.
Charlie.
Thank you so much, fascinating. So my question goes back to your response regarding conflating A consciousness and B consciousness. So I was curious how your model handles cases where feeling becomes unstable or even epistemically disruptive, such as the case of trauma, depression, affective fragmentation. In these states, phenomenal experience, it seems based on our description, is doing like short circuiting. It neither reliably signals adaptive value nor sustained intrinsic meaning. So do you see these cases as an outlier that press against this evolutionary story, or as the illustration of how multifaceted and complex the nature of this phenomenal experience is?
I'm not sure I fully understood.
So I'm talking about cases that we got this fragmented sense of phenomenal experience, such as memory loss, trauma, disassociation, etc. And I'm thinking whether in your evolutionary story there is a place for them, or no, it shows further that the nature of this phenomenal experience is much more complex, that we could conflate the access level, the access consciousness versus phenomenal consciousness.
Yeah, probably the latter, but I must say I haven't thought of this, and I'm not sure I put them up with an answer right off the bat. Maybe we talk about this later.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering if you thought that studies on blind side where participants are shown a house that's on fire on their blind side, they don't want to live it. They say they don't see it, but they don't want to live in it. If that is such an example of a valence unconscious perception.
Yeah, I would have to admit that, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, I want to go back to the unconscious pain being an oxymoron. I would argue that unattended pain is also an oxymoron.
Okay.
A feeling that you're quoting the work of Beecher after World War II with the people lost arms and stuff and said they didn't feel it. I think it could be explained by the spotlight theory that the pain is for them when they're not feeling it is in the preconscious, which means it's available to be felt if you attend to it, but you're not feeling pain when you're not attending to it, and that's part of the function of consciousness. I would think is you can shift the tension around.
Oh, absolutely.
And that determines what you feel.
Well, that's the way I think about it. But this very distinction you're making is super important, and it has been completely ignored or resulted in confusions in different literatures. The behavioral priming literature, etc. Is this distinction between unconscious stimulation devices, as is the case for surveillance, where the stimulus is degraded, that's one that we process it anymore. And on the one hand, and then unattended or automatic contents on the other hand, which are characterized by very strong representations, but that have the properties of being pre-conscious indeed in the sense you described. It's not that phenomenology is impossible with that with those kinds of stimuli. It's just that you have to pay attention to it. Just as when you're driving, you can have a conversation with someone, but if you pay attention to what you're doing, you can bring all the phenomenology back, which is not something that you can do with a subliminal stimulus. And so the pain, I think, is properly described not as being unconscious, but as being unattended.
Oh, thank you. So my question follows up a bit on Paul and Sophie and others were talking about. So I agree with Paul that you probably could have evaluation without phenomenal consciousness. Indeed, I think that a lot of this value that phenomenal consciousness, to the extent that we reject illusionism, maybe phenomenalism, and accept the evolutionary story and grant some functional value to phenomenal consciousness. A lot of it could be done, maybe all of it could be done without phenomenal consciousness. So I wonder to what extent you're committed to it being a necessary, necessary requirement for doing certain types of jobs, or do you think it's sort of a contingent accident of evolutionary history that we happen to be this, but we could have evolved into zombies that have other ways of getting those things done?
Well, my intuitions say no, we couldn't. But it's a complicated issue. That is the question that everybody, I think, is trying to answer, right? So yes, we have to admit that evaluation can take place without awareness. Some organisms, maybe in some systems, in humans. But I also think that we need to think of a role, a functional role for what it is that we feel. So one of those roles, at least from the perspective we're trying to develop, is to make it possible for you to experience values.
Could you just code that value into a data set or memory bank?
Maybe. I don't know. Who knows? I think not, but I don't want to argue that. I mean, whatever it is that we experience has to be based on mechanisms, right? So I fully agree with that. It's not an issue of imagining phenomenal experience as being completely disconnected from whatever mechanisms instantiates it. But can it be fully reduced to those mechanisms? I don't know what to say. Those are complicated questions.
Okay, I think it's time to eat, drink, and be merry. I'm there.